So before we begin today, here's your Lewis fun fact for the week. C.S. Lewis once wrote that he did not come into Christianity to be made happy. He said, and I love this, that a bottle of port would do that. He came instead because he believed it was true. Not comfortable, true. Hold on to that, because today we're going to talk about what happens when Christianity gets hijacked by the very thing Lewis was pushing back against, the desire to make faith comfortable and manageable and transactionally safe. So hello, fellow Inklings, and welcome back to the Eagle and Child, the meeting place at a pub over a beer of J.R. Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, and the rest of the Inklings. So last week I told you my own story, the seasons of real suffering. I told you I didn't have clean answers, and that is absolutely still true. But today I want to do something different. I want to take you on a tour through history, because the way most of us were taught to think about suffering, where it comes from, what it means, and what God has to do with it, that didn't come from nowhere. It came from somewhere very specific, and some of it has caused tremendous damage. Okay, so let's go back. Let's go way back. Long before church councils or systematic theologies, there was suffering. And the gut-level human instinct was always the same. Find out what the gods want and give it to them. Ancient cultures across the world operated on a simple and terrifying logic. Drought, disease, defeat in battle, the death of a child. These were not random. They were messages from angry gods. And the only way to restore the relationship was through sacrifice. The more it cost you, the more seriously the gods will take it. And this was the dominant religious logic of the entire ancient world. Something deep in human nature kept reaching the same conclusion over and over again. Suffering is punishment, and punishment requires appeasing God. If you grew up in a tradition that taught you God sent suffering to punish you, or that Jesus had to die to satisfy divine justice or an angry God, you need to know you're not dealing with a uniquely Christian idea. You're dealing with one of the most oldest religious instincts in human history. And here's what gets overlooked. The God of Scripture kept pushing back against this logic. So when God stopped Abraham from sacrificing Isaac, a narrative that many preachers say was God testing Abraham, but Abraham named the place not the Lord who tests or the Lord who demands, but the Lord will provide. That name tells us everything about the true character of God. And the prophets kept saying it. Hosea quotes God directly. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. See Hosea 6:6. Micah said what God requires is not sacrifice, instead, but to act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly. See Micah 6:6-8. And then Jesus quoted Hosea directly, twice, when religious leaders criticized him. He says, go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. See Matthew 9:13. He was saying this transactional framework, it's been wrong from the beginning. And yet, despite everything Scripture said, the ancient instinct kept finding new forms. In the 1st and 2nd centuries, the Gnostic Christians and the Marcionites blamed a second, inferior God for creating a world full of suffering. The creator God, he was the bad God. The God of Jesus, well, he's the good God. Then in the 5th century, St. Augustine gave the punishment narrative a permanent home inside human nature itself with the doctrine of original sin. The idea that we are born guilty, born deserving of punishment, before we're capable of a single choice. And then during the Protestant Reformation, after 1517, Martin Luther called humanity a pile of manure. And John Calvin said whatever remained of human nature after the fall was but horrible deformity. And I want to tell you something personal here. When I was living through my own moral failure, the shame was crushing. And I still remember a pastor telling me with genuine anger in his voice that I deserved to be punished with a terrible disease. Of course, I was terrified. This is what happens when the ancient instinct gets theological foundation. Now here's a piece of history that genuinely shocked me. And I was angry that no one taught it to me when I was in church growing up. For the first 1,000 years of Christian history, the dominant understanding of what Jesus accomplished on the cross was not about satisfying God's anger and justice. Instead, it was a debt paid not to God, as a lot of us were taught, but to Satan. That's right. For 1,000 years, the majority view was that Jesus died a ransom to ransom us from the devil, not to appease the wrath of God. The early theories, the ransom theory of atonement, Christus Victor, recapitulation, were all restorative in nature, not retributive. None of them assumed a debt owed to God. None required God to be the one demanding payment. And that then changed not until 1098, when Anselm of Canterbury wrote, "Why did God become human?" Anselm was writing in a feudal world of honor and debt. An offense by a peasant against the Lord, well, it had to be satisfied. It was just not enough to say, "I'm sorry." The greater the Lord, the greater the required payment. Since humanity had offended an infinite God, only an infinite payment would do. And so the debt just moved from Satan to God to protect God's honor. And then came along John Calvin. Now, Calvin was a trained lawyer, not a trained theologian. And he brought a lawyer's instinct for penalty and retribution to Anselm's framework. He took Anselm's feudal court of honor and turned it into a criminal court. It was no longer just a concept of substitutionary atonement, but he added the concept of penal to make sure everyone understood it as punishment, to ultimately become penal substitutionary atonement. Jesus was no longer satisfying the debt of honor. He was absorbing a criminal sentence. It wasn't just satisfaction, it was punishment. And not just payment, but eternal retribution, wildly disproportionate to the offense. The sin you commit in your limited time on earth deserves eternal punishment. But to Calvin's credit, a strong legal argument if you accept his premises. Now, here is where I have to pause and be transparent with you. I am also only a trained lawyer, not a trained theologian. So Calvin and I share that in common. But I'll tell you this. If I were standing in that courtroom today, I would be on the other side of the room entirely. Because I want to defend the character of God against what I believe is the most damaging misrepresentation in the history of the church. Before I make my case, I want to show you something in Scripture that most people have never noticed. It's a thread that runs from the very beginning of Genesis all the way to the Sermon on the Mount. It starts in Genesis 4. After Cain killed his brother Abel, God actually protected Cain, placing a mark on him and declaring that anyone who killed Cain would suffer 7 times over. That's in Genesis 4:15. Now that phrase, 7 times, was not meant as a threat of disproportionate punishment. In the ancient world, 7 was the number of completeness. So God was saying, Cain is fully protected, and let's stop the violence. This was an act of mercy toward a murderer, not a model for escalating retaliation. But then Cain's descendant, Lamech, twisted that mercy into a boast of violence. He said, I have killed a man for wounding me. If Cain is avenged 7 times, then Lamech 77 times if anyone tries to retaliate against him. That's in Genesis 4:23 through 24. What God had offered as complete protection, Lamech turned into a license for, literally unlimited revenge. The spiral of retribution had already begun to escalate wildly out of proportion. And then later, the Mosaic law tried to put a ceiling on that spiral. The famous command, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, that's in Exodus 21:24, that was not a license for cruelty. Instead, it was a limit. Punishment should be no worse than the offense. So it became more of a quid pro quo, tit for tat type system, but very transactional. It was an attempt to rein in the kind of excess Lamech had boasted about and restore a measure of fairness. Now let's move to the New Testament in the perspective of Jesus. So Peter once asked him, how many times should I forgive my brother? 7 times? And Jesus answered, no, not 7 times, but 77 times. That's in Matthew 18, 21, 22. And 77 times, let's pause here for a moment, that's the NIV translation. Some translations say 70 times 7. It really doesn't matter, but I like this translation, not just because my uncle was on the small group of translators of the NIV, which he was, but because clearly Peter and Jesus are referring back to Cain and Lamech. It's also 77 in the King James Version. Okay, so there it is, 77. The exact number Lamech used as a boast of what is practically unlimited violence. Jesus turned into command of symbolic unlimited forgiveness. The entire arc of Scripture moves from Lamech's 77 times revenge to Jesus' 77 times of grace, which is why what Calvin did was such a catastrophic reversal. Penal substitution doesn't move us forward along that arc. It drags us backward, past Moses, past Lamech, all the way back to the most primitive logic of all, infinite punishment for a finite offense. Not 77 times harsher than crime, eternal punishment. Now listen now to what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, his most important sermon. Matthew 5, 38 to 39. He said, and I'm quoting directly, "You've heard it said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth." That is Jesus quoting the old Mosaic law. So I'm stepping back a moment. Now let's go back. "But now I say, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn him the other cheek also." In other words, no atonement, no satisfaction, no revenge, no retribution, no punishment, no punitive response at all. Just complete forgiveness, period. And just to make sure this was crystal clear, Jesus doubled down. If anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. And then he tripled down. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Then he quadrupled down. Give to the one who asks you and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. How we miss this? Jesus could not be more adamant. He was defending his Father's character, a God and Father of grace and forgiveness. And then a few verses later, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. And as we previously discussed, forgive 77 times. Complete, unlimited forgiveness is what he was saying. This is Jesus speaking. Offering forgiveness is what it means to follow Jesus, according to Jesus himself. Jesus is the greatest human witness we could ever have to the character of God, given he is fully human and also fully God. So the willingness to forgive versus punish is what being a Christian is about. So how do so many Christians today demand belief in a God of wrath who requires Jesus to die before he can forgive? God asks us to forgive completely, but somehow God can't? A God of wrath is not the God who ran down the road to meet the prodigal son. Remember, God specifically said, "I want mercy, not sacrifice." God's character has been distorted for way too long. John Calvin, with all due respect, I believe you were wrong about the character of God. I know that many Christians are shocked to learn that substitutionary atonement was not the dominant belief until the 11th century. And penal substitution was not until the 16th century. I know I was shocked, and I was angry that no one in my evangelical upbringing ever told me that part of church history. For all the theology built around the idea that suffering is the price sin demands, Jesus himself never once punished a sinner. Not once. Not the woman caught in adultery, not the tax collectors he ate with, not the lepers, the outcasts, the morally compromised people religious society had written off. He didn't even get angry at them. So when he was angry, when he overturned the tables in the temple, he was not punishing sinners. He was confronting a religious system that exploited, the very people who came seeking mercy. His harshest words were reserved not for the guilty, but for those who refused to admit they were guilty. Jesus said it himself, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." See Luke 5:31 through 32. Jesus was never in the business of punishment. He was in the business of healing. And here's something I want you to consider. Sin does not actually need God to enforce its consequences. Broken relationships, the erosion of character, the drift away from everything true and good. These are what sin does on its own. Sin has its own punishment. God gives us free will, which allows us to sin. And sin then carries its own weight. The younger son didn't end up having to be in the pigsty because the father arranged it. He ended up there because of his own choices. God was not the punisher in that story. God was the one waiting for his child to come home, and he received him with absolute grace and forgiveness. So before I close, every framework in this post, sacrifice, original sin, penal substitutionary atonement, runs on the same underlying logic. You get what you deserve. Punishment for the guilty, reward for the worthy. We've spent this whole post on the punishment half, but there is a reward half too, and it has done just as much damage, but in a more subtle way. If suffering is what the guilty deserve, then prosperity, health, and success must be what the faithful deserve. That is what's called the prosperity gospel. It's a system of meritocracy. And that is exactly where we're going next week. So fellow Inklings, I want to leave you with this. That ancient instinct, suffering is punishment, and punishment requires appeasing an angry God, is one of the oldest and most deeply wired responses in the human soul. It's understandable. It makes logical sense to us. And it has shaped Christianity for centuries in ways most of us never knew because no one told us that history. But it is not the heart of the gospel. That is not the form of Christianity as described by Jesus. Jesus never punished. Jesus healed. Jesus preached against atonement theology adamantly and clearly. And if Jesus is the full revelation of who God is, then maybe it's time to let that ancient instinct go. It's time to follow Jesus in what he clearly says. The story of the Bible that it teaches is not one of sinners in the hands of an angry God, as Jonathan Edwards once proclaimed. It is the story of a God who wants to heal us and is waiting with open arms for us to come home. The case I've been building today comes down to this. Two lawyers looked at the same God and came to very different conclusions. Calvin saw a judge who demanded blood before he could forgive. I see a father who ran down the road before his son could even finish his apology. One of those pictures came from a criminal courtroom as part of the Protestant Reformation. The other came from Jesus. I know which one I am going to follow. And I think deep down, maybe so do you. Fellow Inklings, until next week, grace and peace.